You do not actually need to be a psychic to know when someone loves you. You just have to stop assuming that their silence is empty of feeling. While we were in the car on the way to finalize our divorce, I suddenly realized I could read minds. My husband, Morrison, sat there looking cool and aloof with a face of pure disdain, yet his inner voice was telling a completely different story. Honey, I really do not want to do this. Maybe I should just tell her I'm not feeling well, so we can go home. Please do not leave me. Sarah, a guy who is as handsome and in shape as I am is a total catch. And if another woman finds me, she is definitely not giving me back. Even though he had no idea, I could hear him. His thoughts were racing with things that contradicted his cold exterior. He was thinking that I made him so frustrated today, but then he immediately thought that if I would just hold him while we slept tonight, he was sure he would feel better by morning. Ours was a whirlwind marriage where we had agreed to build our relationship after the wedding. However, we were both completely swamped with work, and Morrison's personality was always so reserved. We lived less like a married couple and more like polite roommates. This sudden contrast between his silent face and his loud thoughts sparked a powerful interest in him for the first time. Most importantly, that inner monologue of his did not sound like it belonged to a man who felt nothing for me. I was just starting to realize that there might be a massive misunderstanding between us. Seeing the strange tension in the car, I decided to be the one to break the silence. I asked him if this divorce would affect him too much, and Morrison just gave me a flat response, saying it wouldn't have a major impact. In his head, however, he was sobbing that he was talking about me. He thought that in our social circle, there's an unspoken rule where there are no divorces, only widows. He was mentally wailing that if I divorced him, he would just go throw himself into a crematorium. I froze in my seat, wondering if I had just heard something completely insane. I glanced uncertainly in the rearview mirror, but Morrison was just staring out the window with a cool and detached expression. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things. Just as I was thinking about heading home for a long nap once the paperwork was finished, that mournful voice echoed in my head again. He was thinking about how miserable he was and that he should probably look up the number for the local funeral home. He thought that all the money in the world would not make him happy without me. He pictured himself sitting in our empty mansion in the Hamptons and crying his eyes out. I hesitated for a moment, then glanced at Morrison in the passenger seat again to see if he was serious. I wondered if this could really be an auditory hallucination. I was starting to believe I was actually hearing his inner thoughts, especially since I was positive his lips hadn't moved a bit. As if he could sense my stare, Morrison suddenly turned to meet my eyes. He raised a pale, elegant hand to his forehead and told me he wasn't feeling very well today. He asked if we could postpone the divorce, but in his head, he was cheering himself on for being brave enough to say it. He was mentally begging me to say yes and just go home. He was pleading with me to say yes so we could go home and forget about the divorce. He wondered how he was even supposed to live without me at this point. It was getting incredibly noisy in my head, and I was now certain that I was hearing Morrison's true thoughts. I hesitated for a second before finally speaking, telling him that we could just head back for today. When he heard my answer, his eyes visibly brightened, though he kept his expression neutral and gave a small, prim nod. I knew I had to figure out what on earth was happening to me. As the courthouse disappeared in the rearview mirror, Morrison let out a quiet sigh of relief. He spent the rest of the drive humming happily to himself inside his head. I was just beginning to realize that I did not know my husband at all. I wondered if he was actually the cool, aloof professor everyone thought he was. It turned out he was a total chatterbox and a broken record who was constantly whimpering inside his own head. When we arrived home, we went inside one after the other just like we always did. Morrison, still feigning his illness, went straight to his room to rest. Just before he closed the door, I heard his thoughts again. He was planning to go online to search for ways to win his wife back. He thought about his wardrobe and wondered if he should pick out something special. He questioned what I liked and how he could casually walk in front of me to get my attention. He felt frustrated and wondered why I had to like the Ice King type. He lamented that I had fallen for a block of ice and wondered why I couldn't just like the real him. He told himself he was adorable, felt angry for 3 seconds, and then went back to planning his seduction. Hearing that made me freeze in place. I wanted to ask him who on earth told him I liked the Ice King type. That was a complete fabrication. My feelings were suddenly a complicated mess of confusion and amusement. My impression of Morrison had always been that of the unapproachable Columbia professor who exuded a cool, disciplined aura. I never could have imagined that underneath it all, he was a total softie who just wanted to be coddled. I sighed at the realization. The main question now was what I should do about the divorce. I have never been one to drag things out, and I knew I needed to talk to Morrison before we made a final decision. I wanted to see what he was really thinking. Just then, a knock came at my bedroom door. I snapped out of my thoughts and sat up quickly. Morrison pushed the door open and just stood there in the doorway, looking hesitant. He had clearly just showered and was wearing a black silk robe that hung loosely on his frame. His almond-shaped eyes were downcast, giving him a touchingly vulnerable look. I asked if something was wrong while looking away, feeling a bit awkward in the moment. It was the middle of the night, and we were all alone, so it was hard not to let my mind wander. He told me he still wasn't feeling well and asked if I could take a look as he walked toward me. Before he even reached the bed, his handsome face was already turning bright red. In his head, he was terrified I would say no and told himself he would actually cry if I did. He thought about how he had spent all night psyching himself up for this. I told him I wasn't a doctor and offered to take him to urgent care if he felt that bad. I started to get up, but he pressed me back down with his soft hand on my shoulder. He told me it was okay and that he knew what the problem was. His inner voice was screaming for me not to look at him like that because his heart was about to beat out of his chest. He was so incredibly nervous and kept thinking about how beautiful I was. Maybe it was because his thoughts were racing so fast, but he suddenly blurted out that his chest felt tight and asked if I could rub it for me. The moment those words left his mouth, the room fell into a dead silence. I could have sworn I actually heard his heart stop for a beat. His mind, however, was a total cacophony of internal screaming and regret. Morrison was mentally kicking himself and wishing he could down a few shots to deal with his own recklessness. He wondered how he could have possibly said his little fantasy out loud. That was not what he had planned to say to me at all. A second later, he grabbed my hand and placed it firmly on his chest while biting his lower lip. He whispered that his chest just felt tight and that it would be better if I just rubbed it. His voice trailed off, but the screaming in his head only grew louder and more desperate. He told himself that fortune favors the bold and that he should just go for it and pounce on me. He kept repeating his own name to build up courage. Hearing that, the hand I had pressed to his chest twitched involuntarily. I swear it was a purely instinctual reaction, and I have to admit that he felt very firm. If this was some kind of test of my character, I was failing it spectacularly. I tried to stay focused and mentioned that there was probably an herbal supplement for chest tightness. I tried to stand up because our position was getting way too suggestive and I was feeling awkward. But Morrison had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. Seeing me try to get up, he reflexively pushed me back down onto the bed. He must have misjudged his own strength because the next thing I knew, he had tumbled right on top of me, and we both fell back onto the mattress. Morrison definitely noticed the contact and thought about how great my figure was. He remembered catching a glimpse of me once by accident and wondered if it would be out of line to get closer now. My dazed expression finally broke as his internal commentary made me blush. I stammered and asked him why he didn't get up first. I told him that I was starting to feel a little tight in the chest myself. As I had suspected, Morrison's boldness was mostly in his head. The moment I spoke, he scrambled off me, fumbling with his robe and repeating that he was sorry. His usual cool composure was completely gone. Seeing how flustered he was, I reached out to steady him, but my hand somehow landed right on his waist. The moment I touched him, his entire body went rigid, and he fell right back on top of me. I told him that at this point, it was really hard not to think he was doing this on purpose. My voice was laced with resignation as I looked up at him. Morrison quickly pulled my hands away, his own voice trembling as he insisted that wasn't it. He whispered that I couldn't just touch his waist like that because it was extremely sensitive. I suddenly remembered something from right after we had first gotten our marriage license. We actually had a period back then where we got along pretty well. But I remembered one time at dinner when I casually put my arm around his waist and he instantly tensed up. The smile had vanished from his face in an instant. At the time, I thought I had been way too forward with him. After that, a few other accidental touches to his waist produced the same reaction. He would go completely rigid and his expression would turn icy cold. Over time, I had started to believe that he simply didn't like me touching him at all. It was now clear that this had been a major misunderstanding. I quickly got up, walked to the door, and took a moment to collect my thoughts. I told him to come out because we needed to have a real talk. 2.5 minutes later, we were sitting across from each other on the living room sofa. Morrison smoothed out his robe, though the blush was still very warm on his cheeks. He waited for me to speak, his face once again a mask of indifference. Inside his head, however, he was freaking out and wondering what we were going to talk about. He thought to himself that the only thing he wanted to talk about was our relationship. He remembered that the last time I wanted to talk, it was to ask for a divorce. I wasn't there to talk about romance, of course, though seeing how cute he was being made the idea somewhat appealing. But I knew that wasn't the point right now. His bizarre behavior tonight felt a lot like an attempt at seduction. If that was true, then the misunderstanding between us was even bigger than I had ever imagined. I reminded him that when I brought up the divorce before, he had agreed to it. I asked him if he also felt that our marriage had problems. Morrison's expression remained perfectly cool as he said he didn't believe we had any problems at all. He claimed we had been living exactly according to the terms we had agreed upon. He said that, to be honest, he wasn't entirely sure why I wanted a divorce, but that he had always respected my decisions. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose as he spoke. In his head, he was desperately wondering why I wanted to leave him. He wondered if I had found some other man and if that guy was in better shape or handsomer than him. He questioned if the other guy seemed more sophisticated and aloof than he was. He admitted to himself that he was just faking being cool, but thought he had gotten really good at it. He wanted to know who this man was that was trying to steal his wife. That barrage of thoughts felt like a drill to my temples. It was pure noise pollution for my brain. Who would have guessed that the husband who seems so cool and reserved on the outside is secretly a non-stop chatterbox? It felt like a buy one, get one free deal I never asked for. My brain was so overloaded that I couldn't even think straight. I couldn't stop myself from snapping at him to just be quiet for a second. The words were out of my mouth before I even realized my mistake. I looked up at him, and Morrison pursed his lips, his voice very small as he said he wasn't even talking. But a second later, the chatter in his head started right back up. He thought I was being so stern, but then added that I was incredibly hot when I was like that. He thought to himself that he almost wanted to kneel and call me his queen. He then called himself a pervert, but concluded that if it was me, it wouldn't be so bad. I was once again shocked into silence by his thoughts. I wondered if it was possible for the image of the cool, godlike professor to crumble so completely in a single day. Morrison was now getting nervous, wondering if he had been too forward or if he had revealed too much of himself. He questioned why else I would be acting so strange. He told himself he had every right to be anxious since I was about to divorce him. I finally cut through his frantic thoughts to speak. I told him I just wanted to talk about the issues between us. I reminded him we agreed that if we couldn't find a spark after a few years, or if one of us met someone else, we would get a divorce. I mentioned that he had always had a first love from high school, and that was something I simply couldn't accept. At the mention of his first love, Morrison's cool mask seemed to crack. The blush that had faded from his cheeks crept right back up his neck. His strong reaction made me completely forget what I was going to say next. The little spark of hope that had just ignited in my chest was instantly snuffed out. With a reaction like that, it was hard to believe he didn't still have feelings for someone else. I sighed and looked away from him. I told him that if he was in love with someone else, there was no reason to stay tied to me. I said I couldn't accept my husband being in love with another woman. Morrison looked at me, confused, and thought, "Another woman?" Morrison's blush faded as he stared at me in total confusion. At first, he thought I had discovered his secret fantasies and wanted a divorce because I thought he was a pervert. But now, this didn't seem right to him at all. He thought about how I couldn't accept it when my first love was actually me. He wondered if he should just come out and say it. He felt it was so embarrassing, but wondered if this was his big chance to confess. He regretted not wearing something sexier for the occasion. I was completely speechless. I wondered if he had just implied that I was actually his first love. Morrison went to college overseas, so we couldn't have met there. It must have been middle school or high school. But with a face like mine, I was a pretty decent-looking kid, and it seemed impossible that I would have no memory of him at all. I was about to ask him, but Morrison had already stood up. He told me that when I brought up the divorce before, it wasn't that he didn't care. He explained that there had been a minor crisis with an experiment at the lab at that time. He claimed that his first love was all in the past. He told me he really wasn't feeling well today and suggested we discuss this later. He spoke with perfect clarity, almost returning to his usual cool demeanor. I realized that some people are all business on the outside, but a total mess of whimpers on the inside. I was thinking about how men carry around a lot of strange emotional baggage. I also needed some time to process our chaotic relationship. At least now, I was pretty sure that I was the first love he was so hung up on. I nodded and suggested we talk in 3 days, since I had to go out of town for a day trip tomorrow. Morrison just said okay and looked at me through his glasses. He said he would go get some rest and wish me a good night. The next moment, he was mentally screaming as he slowly walked back to his room. I leaned back on the sofa, my mind going completely blank. The whole day had been surreal, but that voice in my head calling me honey over and over was undeniably sweet. Meanwhile, Morrison was rolling around on his bed like a madman. He felt like his whole body was on fire. He clutched a giant stuffed animal to his face, muffling the screams he desperately wanted to let out. He was frustrated that his big seduction plan had gone so sideways, but he had clearly felt my reaction to him. He wondered if I knew that he had been secretly in love with me for years. The thought made him bury his face in his hands while blushing furiously. A moment later, he sensed that something wasn't right. He shot up in bed, his beautiful eyes filled with confusion. He realized that if I knew I was his first love, I wouldn't have been asking for a divorce because he had someone else in his heart. He frowned, wondering how I even knew about that in the first place. He had been smitten with me since the first time he saw me, way back when he was in the 9th grade. I was a freshman in high school at the time. Back then, Morrison was very young for his grade because he had always been bright and had skipped ahead. He was in 9th grade when most kids his age were only in 7th. But being the youngest kid in class made him an easy target for bullies. One day after school, a few older students had him cornered until I happened to be passing by and stepped in to help. I must have looked pretty intimidating because the bullies eventually backed off while muttering curses. A few of my friends came over from the end of the alley and asked what was up. They wanted me to come shoot some hoops with them. I turned and told them to go on ahead because I thought I'd found a lost kid. From that day on, Morrison never forgot me. But it was painfully obvious to him that I had no memory of him whatsoever. He wondered if he was really that unmemorable, and the thought completely deflated him. He pulled out his phone and furiously typed a message to his best friend, Julian, on iMessage. He asked Julian if he was sure about me liking the cool, quiet type. He complained that he had been playing that part for 2 years and still didn't understand why I didn't like him. Julian replied almost instantly, saying he thought Morrison's real personality was way more likable. Julian reminded him that he had warned the rumor might not be reliable. He then asked if we had actually gone through with the divorce. Morrison blinked, his long lashes fluttering, as he texted back that he told me he felt sick, so he hadn't done it. He admitted that he didn't know what came over him, but he had tried to seduce me. He told Julian that since he was there texting, he could imagine how well it went. On the other end of the line, Harper Montgomery stared at the message in shock. Harper typed back with shaky hands, saying that either I had a problem or he simply wasn't sexy enough. She insisted there was no other way he could have failed. Harper meant every word she said. This was Morrison Sterling they were talking about, after all. With a face and body like his, if he just smiled, every woman at Columbia would have been tripping over themselves to get his number. But the rumor about me liking the cool, aloof type had come from his friend, Julian Brooks, so it should have been reliable. Morrison lay on his bed moping. He thought about how today I had asked if he had been in love with his first love for a long time. He remembered me saying I didn't want a husband who was in love with someone else, and that was why I wanted a divorce. He thought to himself that there was no one else, and that it had always been me. Julian paused before replying drily. Julian said this sounded like the plot of a 300-chapter romance novel. Morrison replied without a second thought, saying there was no way. He mentioned that we had agreed to talk properly in 3 days when I returned from my trip. He told himself he had already tried to seduce me, so he might as well drop the act. His thoughts were tinged with sadness as he realized that if I really didn't like the real him, he couldn't keep up this charade forever. Meanwhile, I was still basking in my newfound discovery, completely unaware of his inner turmoil. After sending out a few work emails, I went to my room to get some sleep. I run a successful graphic novel company. I had poured everything into the studio in the early days, and it had slowly grown. Because of that, I had long since stopped seeing my colleagues as anything other than my team. The studio had just become stable when my mother introduced me to Morrison. We dated for only 3 months before our whirlwind marriage. After we got married, I had intended to make time for us to really get to know each other. However, his cold attitude eventually made me give up on that idea. I was up early the next day to prepare for my trip. To my surprise, Morrison was already up and moving. He came out of the kitchen holding a plate with a sandwich and a glass of milk. He turned at the sound of my footsteps and gave me a slight nod, the corner of his mouth twitching into the faintest hint of a smile. He wished me a good morning, his voice as even as always. He told me he had made breakfast and asked if I would like some. In his head, he was thinking about how hot I looked in a black shirt and that his knees were weak. He thought I looked so dominant. He imagined that if I put on a pair of gold-rimmed glasses, I would be the perfect sophisticated bad girl. He was worried about why I was just staring at him without saying anything and thought about how he was falling for me all over again. I couldn't help but smile at those thoughts, though I quickly composed myself and nodded to him. I wished him a good morning and thanked him for the food. He was mentally ecstatic that I had thanked him, repeating it over and over in his mind. Sure enough, the screaming in his head started again, and some of it was getting a little R-rated. Even though I was starting to get used to it, his fantasies still managed to surprise me. I never would have guessed that the seemingly prim and proper young man had such a wild imagination. I began to realize that what he said in his head wasn't just a heat-of-the-moment thing. Before I left, I glanced at Morrison, hesitating for a moment before saying goodbye. The man who was internally sobbing about me, leaving, simply nodded with a serious expression on his face. He told me to have a safe trip, but just as I turned to leave, he couldn't help himself. He told me my tie was crooked. In his head, he was desperately begging me to ask him to fix it for me. I had been about to just pull the tie off, but hearing his thoughts, I paused. I apologized and asked him if he could fix it for me since I didn't want to go back inside. Morrison agreed, his voice sounding a little too cheerful for his stoic persona. He cleared his throat and added in a more neutral tone that he would get that for me. I realized right then that his acting skills were actually terrible. I wonder how I had never noticed it before. The joy and excitement in his beautiful almond eyes were absolutely impossible to miss. The tie wasn't even crooked. He just wanted an excuse to get closer to me. He sighed to himself about how other husbands get goodbye hugs when their wives leave for a trip. He thought it was fine that he had to invent excuses because their wives weren't as beautiful as his. He was thinking about how sad it was that he wouldn't see me for a couple of days. We were standing so close that I could hear his thoughts clearly, but a hug still didn't feel right. Not when we had been on our way to get a divorce just yesterday. Just then, I caught that familiar fruity scent of his cologne. My mind flashed to the dream I had last night. I thought about his firm waist and the sweet way his voice sounded when he called me honey. I could feel my face getting hot from the memory. I cleared my throat to break the tension. His hands lingered on my tie for a second longer before he reluctantly pulled away. He told me I was all set. I smiled and turned to go, but hearing the frantic train of thought in his head, I stopped and told him I would be back soon. Just as I had hoped, the internal sobbing stopped, replaced by a chorus of mental kisses for me. It was cute, but I wondered if it wasn't exhausting for him to maintain such a huge contrast. For the first time in my life, a business trip felt like a chore. I wanted to be back home before I had even left. I was traveling with my good friend, Julian Brooks. Over the years, we had grown from a small studio into a decent-sized company. We had signed a lot of artists and published several original graphic novels. However, we hadn't made much headway into film or television adaptations yet. When we met up at the airport, Julian looked at me, clearly puzzled by my good mood. He asked me why I was so happy when I was supposed to be getting a divorce. He mentioned he heard we didn't even go through with it. I told him he was well informed and asked how he knew we hadn't. Julian just laughed in response. He couldn't very well admit that he was still in touch with Harper Montgomery. They had broken up ages ago, and he knew people would laugh if they found out he still had her number. More importantly, Julian didn't dare admit that he had accidentally let my preferences slip during a chat with Harper. He quickly changed the subject and mentioned that my husband was a total knockout. He said that if the two of us really split up, women would be lining up around the block for him. He was carefully probing as he spoke because his ex had put him up to this. She had asked him to gauge my actual feelings. Besides, Julian genuinely thought Morrison was great and seemed like my perfect type. He wondered how things had even gotten to the point of divorce. Hearing that, a slow smile spread across my face. I told him he seemed very interested in my husband. I said I had been thinking about it, and I wondered if the reason I wanted a divorce was because he told me Morrison had been hung up on his first love for years. Julian hadn't expected me to bring that up, and he swallowed hard. He admitted he had said that and claimed the information was solid since it came straight from Harper. He hesitated before finally confessing in a hushed tone. He told me not to be mad and that he had no idea the information was so bogus. That was when everything finally clicked for me. Yesterday, Morrison's thoughts mentioned that he was trying to be the cool, intellectual type. It was all because these two gossips had been playing a game of telephone. The problem was that I didn't even like that type. I shot Julian a dangerous look for his meddling. I had a strong feeling that he and Harper were the source of Morrison's entire misunderstanding. He asked if it was really that big of a deal. Julian said he just saw that I had a good first impression of Morrison when we first met. He figured that if Harper was asking, it must mean Morrison was into me too. He claimed he was just giving her a little hint about what I like, acting as a wingman. I told him he did a great job being a wingman, but warned him never to do it again. That explained everything. When we first met, Morrison wasn't nearly this cold. He was quiet, but he used to smile a lot. But after he got married, he put up this wall between us. Add in the misunderstanding about his waist. And over time, I became convinced he was just unhappy with me. So, that was the root of the entire problem. I took a deep breath. Some people have a master strategist for a best friend, but I got whatever this was. At least now, I knew exactly where my husband had gotten all of his bad intel. I guess I had both Julian and Harper to thank for that mess. The trip didn't go as planned at all. What was supposed to be a 1 or 2 day affair dragged on for nearly a week. The talk I had scheduled with Morrison had to be postponed again and again. But things were definitely different this time. In the past, whenever I traveled for work, Morrison would basically go silent. Since I had to postpone our talk, I called to let him know personally. Morrison was very understanding and didn't complain once. After that, he started sending me good morning and good night texts every day. He would occasionally share little stories about his day at the university. I got the feeling that this was all very new for him. He even asked once if his messages were distracting me from work and offered to stop if they were. I could practically hear the sad little whimper in his head as I read that message. I texted back that they weren't a distraction at all and were actually very interesting. He just replied with a simple, stoic "oh." It seemed like a cool response, but after that, he started sharing even more with me. He sent a picture of a beautiful view from his commute and a photo of a stray cat on the street. I had been gone for a week, but I felt closer to him than when we saw each other every day. The trip itself was a bust, and the deal fell through, but you can't rush business. I was still in a pretty good mood on the way back, regardless. As I got off the plane, I wondered what his reaction would be if I just showed up unannounced. I figured he was probably teaching a class right now. The thought made me head straight for the university to find him. Morrison was the youngest physics professor at Columbia. Despite his age, he was a lab rat through and through. He was only in his late 20s, but he had already published multiple papers in prestigious journals. The man was truly brilliant. He was currently supervising 4 graduate students. When I got there, I saw him in the lab with a stern expression on his face. He was facing 4 students who looked to be about his age. He told them he was going to say it one last time, his voice sharp as he spoke. He said they could either do the work or apply for a transfer if they felt he wasn't capable of advising them. His voice was genuinely cold in that moment. It was an icy edge I had never heard from him before. He could seem aloof, but his tone had never been this harsh with me. I watched him through the glass partition and had a sudden, unexpected thought. Maybe I really did have a thing for the Ice King type after all. For instance, looking at Morrison right now in his white lab coat, he exuded this incredibly powerful aura. My heart started to beat faster just watching him. For some reason, my mind flashed to some anime I had seen and the ridiculous phrase about a man stepping on me. One of the students, a guy named Peter, knew he shouldn't be zoning out like that. But since I was standing right there in the hallway, I was hard to miss. He couldn't help but sneak a few glances my way. With only a few of them in the lab, his wandering gaze was painfully obvious to Morrison. He asked Peter what he was looking at and if his experimental data was somehow out in the hallway. He turned his head as he spoke, and that was when I witnessed the ultimate transformation in him. The Ice King professor, who had just been mentally reciting a calming mantra to deal with his students, saw me, and a flicker of pure shock crossed his face. He didn't say a word out loud, but his mind erupted into a full-blown party. He was thinking about how I was back and wondering if I was there to pick him up from work. He worried if he had been too harsh just now. He mentally begged me not to get the wrong idea about him. He thought about how he wasn't mean, but actually super gentle. He blamed the stupid experiment and the students who wouldn't listen for his mood. He calculated that he hadn't seen me in 168 hours, not counting our brief moment this morning. He broke it down into 10,000 minutes or over 600,000 seconds. He thought about how much he missed me. His syrupy, sweet thoughts about me left me feeling a little dazed. I couldn't stop a smile from spreading across my face, though. I was done for, hook, line, and sinker. I gave Morrison a nod, signaling for him to finish up what he was doing. He had clearly lost all interest in scolding his students, but he tried not to make it too obvious to them. He turned back to the 4 students, his expression still appearing tight and serious. But the entire atmosphere around him had completely shifted. He told them that if the issues he pointed out today happened again, they shouldn't bother coming back. He said they shouldn't waste each other's time. With that, he waved them away. The 4 of them let out a collective sigh of relief and immediately looked out the window. They had all seen what happened. The moment their professor laid eyes on the woman outside, his entire demeanor had changed. I didn't mind them staring at all, and I was in such a good mood that I actually gave them a nod. Morrison cleared his throat to get their attention. He asked them if they wanted to stay and continue their experiments because he was leaving. He took off his lab coat as he spoke to them. One of the students, a girl named Lily, worked up the courage to ask the professor if that was his wife out there. Morrison was secretly staring at me, already humming a happy tune in his head. This was the first time I had ever come to pick him up from work. Hearing Lily's question, he gave a prim nod. But inside his head, he was absolutely gushing with pride. He thought about how beautiful I was and how I got everyone's attention the moment I showed up. He complained that he hadn't even gotten to look at me enough himself yet. He wished he could just hide me away from the world. He thought about how he had been looking at the stars every night and thinking of me. He told himself that while the stars were in the sky, I was in his heart. I listened to his internal monologue as he walked out, his face remaining a mask of calm. When he reached me, he offered a faint apology for keeping me waiting. He said he didn't know I was coming today. The man in front of me and the noisy voice in my head were 2 completely different people. I sighed internally and reached out, naturally tucking a stray strand of hair behind his ear. I told him it was no problem and that I had come to take him to dinner. I apologized for postponing our talk, noting that I said 3 days, but it had ended up being over a week. As I raised my hand to his cheek, Morrison felt his heart skip a beat. All the cute, frantic thoughts in his head came to a screeching halt as his heart started beating erratically. It was true that someone could completely hijack his heartbeat just by getting close to him. He thought to himself that he was done for with just one touch and that he had fallen in love with me all over again. He He noted that this was the 998th time he had fallen for me. He thought that one more would make it 999. He wondered when I was finally going to fall for him. This thought felt different from the others, and I could hear a genuine sadness in it. Maybe it was time I really got to know him and try to understand these feelings he had for me. But the doorway of a university lab was obviously not the place for that kind of conversation. We walked out side by side. We were quiet, but only on the outside. In reality, I was listening to a one-man comedy show. He was a real talker in his head, and his mind was full of a surprising amount of R-rated material. When I heard him debating whether or not to try and seduce me tonight, I couldn't resist glancing over at him. Professor Sterling had beautiful features, but his face was usually an emotionless mask. With his glasses on as we walked down the street, he had a powerful presence. He was trying so hard to press his lips together to keep from smiling, which softened his otherwise stern features. The contrast between his face and the fireworks-level celebration happening in his head was so amusing that my exhaustion completely melted away. I asked him if there was anything he was in the mood for. Even though he had been mentally chanting about wanting to take me for Korean barbecue, he just glanced at me and asked what I was in the mood for. He mentally scolded himself, asking what was wrong with him. He thought that saying that was the same as saying whatever. He told himself he wasn't a whatever kind of guy. He thought he was supposed to be cool and aloof, not difficult, and wished for a do-over. He wanted to slap himself. He kept thinking barbecue, barbecue, barbecue. He wondered if wishing for it really hard would actually work. I suggested that if he didn't have a preference, we could have Korean barbecue tonight. Morrison said that was fine, a hint of excitement slipping into his voice even though he tried to keep his face neutral. He thought about how we were on the same wavelength and how happy he was. He even thought about wanting to kiss me. My own mood lifted even higher hearing that. Since he was determined to stick to his Ice King persona, I decided to take the lead. I asked him what his students had done to upset him earlier. The happy humming in his head stopped abruptly. His voice was a little stiff when he spoke, explaining that it was an experiment. He said he had walked them through it step by step and practically did it for them. He complained that they doubted one of his steps, changed it, and ended up with corrupted data. I offer that doubts are normal, but he said they were convinced they were right and refused to even try and verify his method. When he talked about his work, his tone became serious and his brow furrowed. He said the main problem was that this wasn't the first time. He had proven them wrong several times before. He said they still insist on doing things their way and refuse to follow his guidance. It was clear he was genuinely frustrated and at a loss. Mentoring students like that was just a form of mutual torture for everyone involved. He was worried that I had seen him yelling at them. He wondered if I thought he was mean now, and told himself he wasn't mean at all, but actually really gentle. I wasn't much for academic research myself, but my entire family was in that world, so I could understand his frustration. I looked at him and suggested he should ask my parents for advice. I told him they had mentored plenty of students. He wondered if the topic was boring and thought about how his life was just experiments and research projects. He thought about me, and his mood seemed to dip. He believed he was a boring person and that it was no wonder I didn't like him. I clarified that I suggested he ask my parents not because the topic was boring, but because I wasn't in his field. I explained that I couldn't give him any useful advice, but they could. I told him that if he was too shy to ask, I could do it for him. At my explanation, his eyes lit up. It was the first time I had ever seen someone's face literally light up like that. His emotions had probably always been this transparent, but I just hadn't been willing to spend the time to see them before. That was exactly how our misunderstanding had grown so deep. We chose a Korean barbecue place in a mall near the campus. The restaurant had private booths separated by partitions and hanging fabric curtains. They were small, but they offered a nice private space for us. When we sat down, the server asked if we wanted them to cook for us. Morrison answered without a second thought, saying no thank you and that he was going to cook for me. He thought about how the last time he came here with other professors, they all had someone to cook for them, and he believed his wife deserved that too. His logic was a little strange, but I soon realized I had given him too much credit. It turned out that Morrison had absolutely no idea how to actually cook on the grill. The moment his pale hand touched the hot metal, he yelped in pain. I immediately grabbed his hand to check on him. He wondered if this basically counted as holding hands. He wished I would just kiss it better, but then told himself he couldn't ask for that. He kept thinking about how much it really hurt. I had been frowning at his hand, but hearing his internal whimpering, I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me. I knew kissing it was definitely not an option right then. I asked him if it hurt a lot. I asked if I should ask the server for some ice or run out and get some burn cream for him. He told me it was fine, and seeing the concern in my eyes, he completely forgot his Ice King act for a moment. His voice even started to stammer as he insisted he was okay and that it didn't really hurt that much. He carefully pulled his hand back from mine. It wasn't that he didn't want the contact, but with me staring at him so intently, he felt his resolve weakening. He might have been wild in his imagination, but in reality, he was incredibly shy. In the end, I just pressed the service button and asked for some burn cream. Morrison took it and quickly applied it himself. When the server asked again if we needed help with the cooking, he didn't dare say a word. His plan to cook for me had ended in total embarrassment. I waved the server off, picked up the tongs, and expertly started grilling the meat myself. Morrison's eyes went wide as he watched me work. I placed a perfectly cooked piece of meat in his bowl. He thought about how I had cooked this just for him and almost didn't want to eat it. I told him to go ahead and eat and that I would handle the rest. I told him I had worked at a barbecue joint for a month in college when I was broke. Hearing that, Morrison asked without thinking if that was when my parents were trying to get me to switch my major. He remembered seeing some really downbeat posts on my Facebook during the second semester of my freshman year. He had seen a friend comment telling me to just go home and apologize to my parents. Later, through my back and forth comments with friends, Morrison pieced together that my family had cut me off financially for choosing to major in literature. I, on the other hand, was completely surprised he knew that. That had happened during my freshman year, and it hadn't lasted very long. My older sister felt bad for me and secretly slipped me cash, so very few people even knew about it. I wonder how he could possibly know. Morrison started to panic because he had let his guard down and spoken without thinking. He was about to say he had heard it from Julian, but when he met my gaze, he hesitated. He admitted he'd follow me on social media back then, even though he was only in high school. Seeing that he was finally opening up about the past, I saw my chance to learn more. I kept my tone very gentle. I asked him how old he was and if he must have been in middle school at the time. Morrison's face flushed a deep red at the question. The spot on his hand where he had been burned seemed to be radiating heat, even though he had already put cream on it. I wondered if maybe it wasn't just his hand that was burning, but his entire being. He had always been decisive and quick to solve any problem. But when it came to the equation of love, he always seemed to hesitate. He thought to himself that he didn't want to play the part of the Ice King forever. He wanted me to know the real him. I could sense his fear, so I didn't press him any further. I was still stunned by the depth of his feelings. This man in front of me seemed to genuinely be in love with me. I found myself wondering once again where we could have possibly met all those years ago. I noted that by the time he was a freshman, I was already studying abroad. I was a sophomore in college back then. I knew my husband was brilliant, but I was still impressed. I told him he was brilliant, even more than I had realized. The praise seemed to give him a sudden boost of courage. Morrison took a deep breath and said it all in a rush. He told me that we actually met before he went abroad. He said I thought he was a lost middle schooler and took him to find a police officer. He looked a little embarrassed as he admitted it. He explained that he just hadn't hit his growth spurt yet. Even though he knew I probably wouldn't remember, he still looked a little disappointed by my blank expression. He quickly explained that because of renovations, the ninth graders had been temporarily moved into the high school building for a semester. I did actually remember that happening. But looking at the sophisticated, confident man in front of me now, I couldn't fathom how I could have mistaken his ninth grade self for a middle schooler. I thought to myself that he must have been absolutely tiny back then. As if he were reading my mind, Morrison's face turned red as he explained that he had skipped a few grades and really hadn't hit puberty yet. I couldn't help but laugh at the image. I told him he must have been a very cute middle schooler. I mentioned that I had always wanted a cute little brother. I said that if I went out of my way to help him back then, he must have been adorable. I teased him, saying I normally wouldn't have bothered to help. My words seemed to leave him in a daze. My attitude toward him had done a complete 180 today, and it clearly filled him with joy. But what I didn't expect was for the line that had been replaying in his head to suddenly come out of his mouth. He declared that he wanted to be my husband, not my brother. It was a very direct statement. I had only been speaking metaphorically, as I didn't actually want another brother. But seeing him sitting there, his face flushed with embarrassment, I thought this was actually great. It seemed like he was finally letting his guard down with me. I decided to press my advantage and ask him about this first love. But Morrison was still mortified by his own outburst. Maybe because he thought we were getting divorced anyway. He had developed a bit of a what-the-hell attitude. It was like he couldn't hold back his true feelings anymore. He thought it had felt liberating to say it, but now, meeting my gaze, he was mentally cringing. Thankfully, I didn't press him on that particular comment. The thought made him break into an uncontrollable smile, and he mentally cheered that I was so gentle. Hearing that, I had to look down to hide my own smile, afraid I would laugh at the sheer contrast. After a round of internal gushing, Morrison finally spoke up. He explained that the first love thing was kind of a misunderstanding, but not entirely. He said if he had to name one, it would only be me. Now that the words were out, Morrison wasn't about to retreat. He told me he went abroad when he was very young and his field of study demanded his full attention. He said that what he told me before we got married was the truth, and his relationship history was as clean as his medical records. Morrison's feelings for me hadn't developed overnight. After I'd stepped in to help him, he had silently committed my face to memory. During that semester in the high school building, he had learned a lot about me. I had good grades and an outgoing personality, and I was always on the basketball court with my friends while a crowd of girls watched from the sidelines. He had heard I was nice to everyone, but there were never any rumors about me dating anyone. He tried walking past me a few times, but it was like I had completely forgotten he even existed. I never once noticed him. He had secretly found my Instagram handle back then. I had accepted his follow request without a second thought, just sending a quick message asking who he was. It was the first time he had ever done something like that, and he felt both terrified and guilty about it. He wasn't even sure why he felt that way. It took him a long time to reply and tell me he was a student from my high school. Unfortunately, that message went unanswered. I never replied, and just like that, he finished his story. He said he had been following me on social media ever since. Morrison glanced at me nervously, afraid he would see disapproval or disgust on my face. But all I felt was pure astonishment. I never would have guessed that we had met so long ago. I used to share a lot of my life on my social media accounts back then. I had a lot of followers, including plenty of underclassmen and especially girls. Because of that, I usually just accepted requests without thinking much of it. I looked at Morrison, who was watching me so cautiously. It was strange. It was the same face that, when he wore his usual stern expression, was too intimidating to look at for more than a second. But now, his almond eyes were filled with nervousness, and he quickly averted his gaze after meeting mine. I chose my words carefully. I asked him if I had been rude. I explained that back then, I got so many requests every day that I usually didn't reply unless it was something important. He thought about how he couldn't keep up with everything. Morrison let out a huge sigh of relief in his head. He was just glad that I didn't think he was some kind of creep. Hearing his thought, a smile returned to my face. I was actually starting to get used to this split personality of his. It was actually kind of refreshing. I told him I had brought up the divorce because I thought he was in love with someone else, and I didn't want to stand in his way. But now that I knew it was all a misunderstanding, I asked if he would be willing to give us another try. I spoke suddenly, looking at him with a new sense of seriousness. I reminded him that we had been married for 2 years and had agreed to see how things went. I admitted that because of my work, I felt like I had completely neglected him. I told him I was sorry for that. I said that if he was willing, I would like to try again. I had actually been attracted to Morrison from the start, but we just never had a chance to really connect. Besides Morrison, I hadn't really connected with any other men in years. I didn't think I would be lucky enough to find another guy I was this drawn to. Before, I was attracted to him simply because he was my type physically. But now, after hearing his thoughts, I was genuinely intrigued by him. Who wouldn't be charmed by a handsome guy with such a cute hidden side. Unsurprisingly, Morrison's mind was already erupting in a chorus of yes. It was loud, but I could feel his pure joy. This guy really was in love with me. Even so, he managed to suppress his excitement and said with a forced calm that we should give it a try. He asked how we should go about it, and if we should start dating like a normal couple. I said we could start as friends if that was too fast. He thought to himself that it wasn't too fast at all, and that he wouldn't even mind if we slept together first and figure out the rest later. He wondered if this was what it felt like when things finally turned around for the better. He was excited to date his husband, then realized how weird that sounded, but decided it didn't matter because he was so happy. Listening to his joyful thoughts while looking at his prim face, I couldn't resist adding a correction. I told him that the information he got from Harper about my preferences was actually a little off. I explained that I only said those things as an excuse to turn people down. I told him I wasn't actually into the cool, intellectual type. Hearing this, Morrison's eyes went wide with shock. He realized that I knew about his secret investigation into my tastes. He felt like all those years of pretending to be an ice king had been for nothing. His voice trembled as he asked what type of guy I actually liked. I smiled at his reaction. I told him I was never really sure before, but lately I thought I was starting to figure it out. I suggested that he should just try being himself. I reminded him that we are married, after all, and we were supposed to spend the rest of our lives together. He thought about how I knew everything and that I knew he had been faking his personality this whole time. He felt like he had been a clown this whole time, but was impressed by how smart his wife was. The car ride home was quiet, but not entirely silent in my head. The smile never left my face the entire time. Being with Morrison was a perfect cure for my exhaustion. I couldn't wait to see what he was really like when he finally let his true personality show. When we got home, we were about to head to our separate rooms when Morrison suddenly stopped me. He spoke softly, admitting that he wasn't entirely faking his persona. He said he really was like that in front of his students. He explained that he just thought that was the kind of man I liked. He admitted that with people he is close to, he could be a bit much. He said he was afraid I wouldn't like that side of him. He bit his lip while looking at me nervously. By then, I had already loosened my collar and the top 2 buttons of my shirt. I smiled and asked him how he would know if he didn't try. He tilted his head, studying the smile on my face for a long moment. Then, a smile broke out on his own face as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He agreed to give it a try. I just hadn't expected him to act on that promise so quickly. The next morning, I woke up to find breakfast already on the table along with a sticky note. It said he had class today, so he had headed to campus early. He told me to heat the food up if it got cold. A second line had clearly been added as an afterthought, and the handwriting was slightly different. It simply read, "Good morning, Sarah." Seeing my name on the note, I had a feeling that he had probably wanted to write honey instead. I smiled at the thought, then finished my breakfast and headed to the office. After our morning meeting, I went back to my private office. The moment I opened the door, I saw a woman waiting for me. She was attractive, but her makeup was laid on a little too thick for my taste. She stood up slowly when she saw me and said my name. The thought of Morrison's usual light, natural look flashed through my mind, which I found much more pleasant. I was surprised that he had popped in my head so suddenly like that. I guess I've been thinking about him a lot lately. Victoria Harrington noticed that my gaze only lingered on her for a second before I walked around to my desk and sat down. My cool reception clearly displeased her. We had met when we were both still students. Back then, when Victoria heard about my graphic novel studio, she had actually thought I was some kind of con artist. It wasn't until I came to her campus to discuss a contract that her opinion of me finally changed. Apparently, no one is immune to a handsome face, and since I was visiting her frequently, the other girls started asking if I was her boyfriend. It was a huge boost to her ego at the time, but after she signed the contract, she realized I wasn't just visiting her, I was personally visiting all of our potential artists. Victoria was convinced that if she became a star artist, her position with me would be different. She hoped that maybe a spark could eventually ignite between us. The studio did take off, growing into a very respectable company. But she never imagined that I would suddenly get married. At my gesture, Victoria sat down across from me. Her eyes grew misty as she seemed to recall the past between us. She asked me what that message was that I had Julian send her yesterday. She claimed she cared about me and said that if I had just called her myself, she would have renewed her contract. I told her, keeping my tone professional, that I was only told she had no intention of renewing with us. I explained that Julian only brought it up because she was one of our veteran artists. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have even heard about the situation. I completely ignored her suggestive tone. I knew exactly what Victoria was thinking, but I was her boss, and, more importantly, I was a married woman. I told her that a partnership has to be mutual. Since she had no intention of renewing, I asked her what the point of this visit was. Her voice was filled with disbelief as she reminded me she had been with me since the studio was just starting out. She asked if I didn't think I was being incredibly cold to her. I just gave her a weary look. She was acting as if I had personally wronged her somehow. I pointed out that I had paid her every cent she was owed in royalties and that we had spent a significant amount of money promoting her work. We had operated strictly by the contract. In the early days, I had even borrowed money from my sister just to pay our artists. The truth was that after she signed, I was so busy that I rarely saw her. She would occasionally stop by the studio, and I always assumed she was there to check on a payment. I looked at Victoria's embarrassed face and sighed. I told her to think carefully about the partnership. I explained that the company was looking to get into adaptations and would naturally prioritize our own signed artists. I don't know what was going through her head, but Victoria suddenly stood up and walked quickly around my desk toward me. I instinctively looked up and pushed back with my feet, my office chair rolling safely away from her. Her attempt to sit on my lap failed completely, and because I had moved so quickly, she ended up sitting right on the floor. Just then, my assistant Julian knocked lightly and poked his head into the room. He whispered to me that he thought my husband was here. From behind him, all Morrison could hear was a woman's shriek and the sight of my horrified expression. Morrison was holding a large lunch container in his hands. He hadn't actually intended for anyone to escort him in. He had been checking in at the front desk like any other normal visitor. But Julian had passed by and recognized him immediately. He had only met Morrison once, but with his striking looks and aura, he was unforgettable. So, Julian had hesitantly called out to him as Mr. Sterling. Hearing the title, Morrison had to fight to keep a huge grin off his face. Inside his head, he was doing cartwheels because he loved being called Mr. Sterling. He thought it suited him perfectly since the boss here was his wife. On the surface, however, he just gave a small, dignified nod. In front of strangers, his cool, intellectual persona wasn't an act at all. Once Julian confirmed his identity, he enthusiastically led him toward my office. When he heard I had a visitor, Morrison hesitated, not wanting to interrupt anything. But Julian, who was well aware of Victoria's designs on me, knocked and opened the door in one smooth motion, figuring he was doing me a huge favor. And that is exactly how they walked in on that scene. Victoria's move had been so sudden, and now she was sitting on the floor looking utterly pathetic. Between her shriek and her disheveled state, I was still in shock myself. When I turned and met my husband's wide, curious eyes, I heard his piercing inner thoughts. He was wondering why he had just heard a woman scream, and if there really was another woman. He told himself that I had said there wasn't, and that he had to trust me. He wondered who this disheveled woman was as she picked herself up off the floor. My head was buzzing with the chaos. I quickly called out to Julian to help Miss Harrington up and asked if we should call an ambulance. Julian snapped out of his daze and rushed over to her side. Morrison put down the container he was holding and also went to help, reaching Victoria just as she was getting to her feet. He thought that, as a man, it was probably more appropriate for him to help. He thought that must have been why I hadn't rushed to help her myself. At that moment, Victoria just wanted the floor to swallow her whole. She thought about how pathetic it was to try and seduce someone only to fall flat on her. But she shot me a glare, feeling like she had been wasting her charms on a blind woman. Her gaze then shifted to the man helping her up. Victoria froze because he was absolutely stunning. Even as someone who was pursuing me, she had to admit that the guy in front of her was breathtakingly handsome. She noticed his expressive almond eyes, which were now looking at her with concern as he thoughtfully helped straighten her clothes. Victoria, who hadn't blushed once while trying to seduce me, now felt a sudden pang of shame under his gaze. She stammered that she was fine. I cleared my throat and spoke up, asking Morrison what he was doing here. What I was really thinking was for Victoria to see that this was my husband. I wanted her to know that with a husband this handsome, I was never going to cheat. I hoped she would finally get the message. But my single word, honey, stunned all three of them in the room. In his head, he was screaming with joy because I had called him honey for the first time. He thought that husband and wife sounded so right together. He thought about how much he loved me today and how much he loved hearing that word. He wondered if I would call him that every day and thought he would be the happiest husband in the world. Victoria, however, was completely dumbfounded. The pained grimace from her fall was still frozen on her face. She realized that this was Sarah Miller's husband. It made perfect sense to her now why I wasn't interested in her. Morrison was ecstatic on the inside, but his face remained perfectly calm as he answered my question. He said his class had just ended, so he thought he would see if I was free for lunch. He mentioned he was heading to the library near my office in a bit. He told me he had just sent me a message. I glanced at my phone on the desk, realizing I hadn't had a chance to check it since Victoria had been waiting for me the moment I got out of my meeting. In the end, a dazed-looking Julian escorted Victoria out of the office. I let out a huge internal sigh of relief. I thanked God that I had dodged her in time. If my husband had walked in on that scene a second later, there would have been no explaining it. I was still worried he might get the wrong idea. But when I turned to explain, I was met with a face beaming with pure happiness. Just moments ago in front of the others, he had been so poised and elegant. Now he just looked endearingly goofy. Honestly, he looked like the kind of sweet, naive guy who could be easily tricked into anything. I wondered who would have guessed that this man was a physics professor. I sighed and invited him to have a seat. I asked if he had brought lunch. At the mention of food, Morrison snapped out of his daze, completely forgetting his earlier excuse about just stopping by after class. He told me he had come right after he finished making it himself. He looked at me expectantly and said he hoped I liked it. He mentioned seeing on my old Facebook post that I like spicy food. However, also remembered I have a sensitive stomach, so he had made both a spicy version and a mild one. I was surprised by his thoughtfulness, but I smiled and thanked him. Seeing how happy he was, I grew curious about his reaction to what had happened. I asked him if he was going to ask what that scene was all about. I asked him if he wasn't jealous since that scene was pretty misleading. To my surprise, Morrison just smiled as he continued to unpack the food from the container. He told me he could tell exactly what was happening from the look on my face. He said I looked like I wanted to teleport out from behind my desk. He asked how he could possibly misunderstand that. He thought to himself that the woman was just making a scene. He promised himself he would always trust me unconditionally because he knew I wasn't that kind of person. He prided himself on having excellent judgment. I finally understood why so many people wanted an understanding partner. The difference between someone with high emotional intelligence and someone without it was incredibly stark. The reason my old business partner had suddenly quit was that his girlfriend at the time was pathologically jealous. I thought that while a little jealousy can be cute, she had been completely unreasonable. If her boyfriend was in the same room as another woman, even in a crowded public space, she would have a complete meltdown. But my friend thought it was just a sign of her love, so he actually quit, leaving me to deal with the resulting mess. Hearing Morrison's thoughts now made me smile, and I told him firmly that I thanked him for his trust. But I added that I was still going to explain everything because I didn't like misunderstandings between us. Morrison looked at me with eyes full of sincerity. After I finished explaining, he nodded. He said he knew Sarah, and that you can tell a lot from looking into a person's eyes. He smiled and pointed to his own eyes, saying he could see for himself and that he trusted me. Honestly, he thought that if that woman had actually touched me, he probably would have been a little upset. He reflected that possessiveness is natural when you love someone. But the look of pure terror on my face and the way I looked like I wanted to run for the hills was all the reassurance he needed. He thought that we didn't have much time together as it was, so there was no point wasting it on unimportant people and things. We ate lunch right there in my office. Morrison really was an excellent cook. It was actually the first proper meal he had ever made for me. Morrison smiled and explained that since he went to study abroad at a young age, he had to learn how to do everything for himself. He mentioned that his mother moved back to the States after he turned 18. I suddenly realized that now that we had cleared the air, Morrison wasn't so tense anymore. He was actually smiling a lot, and it made him look even younger. The lunch lasted a while, but it was incredibly rewarding for both of us. I felt like I was finally getting to know him. After we finished, even though he was mentally whining about not wanting to leave, Morrison cleaned everything up with brisk efficiency. The morning's stressful meetings felt a world away, cured by my secretly sweet and affectionate husband. As I helped him clean up the containers, our hands brushed against each other. Morrison froze instantly. Then he looked up at me and whispered that he was getting shy. I was stunned that he was getting shy just from our hands touching. I was taken aback for a second, then I couldn't help but laugh. I told him that Professor Sterling was actually kind of adorable. The adorable person in question was now pressing his lips together, trying desperately not to smile at the compliment. In his head, he wondered why I was suddenly switching to Professor Sterling when I had just been calling him honey. He mumbled something under his breath, his face turning an even deeper shade of red. His voice was barely a whisper, and he sat up ramrod straight, trying his best to appear composed. But he simply couldn't meet my eyes. It seemed like our talk last night had really opened the floodgates for him. He fell silent after his comment, but the expectant look on his face was impossible to miss. I thought to myself that he called me honey hundreds of times a day in his head, but he had never actually said it out loud. I raised an eyebrow and told him that since I had already called him honey, it was only fair that he return the favor. I watched him fidget with his hands, his teeth worrying his lower lip in anxiety. He was still blushing and unable to speak. I wasn't in any rush, so I turned and opened a drawer to take out the burn cream I'd bought for him that morning. I asked him if he had put anything on his hand last night. Seeing that I wasn't going to force the honey issue, Morrison felt a confusing mix of relief and disappointment. He had said it 1,000 times in his head, but now that I had asked him to say it out loud, the words just wouldn't come. My question about his hand finally broke him out of his trance. I walked over to him with the cream. His long, pale hands rested on his lap, looking delicate and beautiful against his dark slacks. The red mark from the burn really stood out on his skin. I told him he needed his hands for his work and that he had to be more careful, then told him to put some of the cream on. I gently placed the tube of cream on the table in front of him. To my surprise, he just blinked at me and then, as if summoning all his courage, held his hand out to me. He said his left hand was a little clumsy and asked if I could put on for me. I looked at the hand he was offering and had to resist the urge to remind him that he had managed just fine on his own last night. But I wasn't that clueless about what he was doing. Morrison was looking up at me with wide, expectant eyes. He thought about how warm my hands were and felt like his own hand was melting under my touch. He thought it wasn't just his hand, but his whole body that was melting. Unsurprisingly, his mind was off to the races again. But you couldn't tell any of that from his expression, as he looked perfectly calm and almost stoic. By the time his thoughts had progressed to a beach trip where I would be applying sunscreen to his entire body, I had finished applying the cream. Luckily, he had treated it quickly yesterday, but the mark was still visible on his pale skin. I lifted his hand toward my lips and blew on it gently. It was just a habitual gesture, and I figured the warm air on the cool cream must have felt soothing to him. For a moment, Morrison seemed to completely freeze in place. Even the frantic monologue in his head went silent. The sudden quiet was actually quite surprising to me. I looked up at him and apologized, saying it was just a habit. As I let go of his hand, he looked almost disappointed by the loss of contact. He said it was okay and that he should probably get going. Seeing his disappointment, I couldn't help but add that next time, if he just told me he wanted to have lunch with me, I think I would be even happier. The man who had been looking so dejected a moment ago visibly brightened up. A wide smile spread across his face, and his beautiful eyes curved into happy crescents. His Ice King facade had completely shattered. It was so endearing that it made me want to reach out and pinch his cheek. I rubbed my fingers together at my side, resisting the urge to do it. I decided I better not, thinking he probably wouldn't be able to drive straight if I did while his mind was going a mile a minute. I told him I would walk him out. I explained that I had a meeting this afternoon, so I couldn't drive him. Morrison followed obediently beside me. His mind was surprisingly quiet, which made me glance at him a few more times in curiosity. My company isn't huge, and this was normally lunchtime when the office should have been half empty. But when I opened my door, I saw that nearly everyone was still at their desks. The office was actually more packed than it usually is for a company-wide meeting. Morrison was also a little taken aback by all the people staring at us. He had put his glasses back on before we left my office. Standing there beside me, he once again looked every bit the cool, handsome Professor Sterling. But only I could hear his restless inner monologue. He was thinking about how hardworking my employees were and wondering if they were all looking at us. He wondered if they thought we made a good couple and giggled to himself about us being a perfect match. He thought that if he had known so many people would be watching, he would have worn a nicer outfit. He called it tactical error and told himself he was still new at this. He decided he should visit a few more times and wondered if I would mind. He figured that since I wasn't saying anything, I probably didn't mind and decided he would definitely come back. Hearing that, I glanced at him and smiled. I told him to let's go and not to mind them, saying they were probably just curious to see what my husband looked like. I gently put my arm around his shoulder as we walked toward the exit. I was still a little hesitant to touch him, worried it might make him uncomfortable. But Morrison had other ideas. His steps faltered for a moment, and he took a tiny step back. Then he deliberately leaned into my embrace. I felt a sudden warmth as his body pressed against mine. In his head, he was screaming that we were hugging. He thought I was such a gentleman. He felt a little frustrated by my restraint, but told himself it was okay because he could be the one to make a move. He wondered to himself if I had abs and bet that they were nice. He questioned when I would finally let him touch them. Hearing that, I quickly steered him toward the exit, trying to derail his train of thought before it went completely off the tracks. Just as we reached the door, a chorus of playful shouts erupted from behind us. They were shouting goodbye to Mr. Sterling and telling him to come back soon. My company was full of young people, and once one person started, the rest of them showed absolutely no shame. I shot them a warning glare over my shoulder. I was worried Morrison would be embarrassed and might not want to visit again. But clearly, I was overthinking it. The smile on Morrison's face grew even wider, and his voice was lilting with amusement as he said my employees had good taste. I smiled back at him and asked which part of their comments he liked. I asked if it was the part where they called him handsome. To my surprise, Morrison stopped walking, unlocked his car with a key fob, and took the empty lunch container from my hand. Once he had everything situated, he looked at me and said seriously that it was actually when they said we were a good match. He told me he thought they had excellent taste. He said he was heading out and wished me goodbye. With that, he turned and hurried to his car. In his head, he was screaming that his heart was racing and that he had said it out loud again. He thought of it as an achievement unlocked for his daily flirtation with his husband. Just as he was opening his car door, he heard my voice, laced with a smile, call out from behind him. I told him I thought they had good taste too, and that everything they said was spot on. I asked him if Mr. Sterling would be visiting us often. In his head, Morrison was chanting yes like a broken record on the verge of breaking into song. But what actually came out of his mouth was a simple promise that he would try, followed by goodbye. I watched him go, feeling very amused. He was so used to this way of speaking and acting that I knew it wouldn't be an easy habit to break. But things were already starting to change, weren't they? Before, he only dared to say these things in his head. Now he was like a kitten tentatively extending its claws, letting slip some of the things he had previously only dared to think. I decided we could take it slow. It seemed he was actually bolder when he had an audience watching us. In his head, he was fearless, but in reality, the slightest bit of flirting made him blush. I watched his car drive off before turning back toward the office. The moment I walked in, a few of the managers I was friendly with pulled me over to a chair they had set out for me. Like I said, it was a young company, and we were all around the same age without many rigid rules. The group, led by Julian, surrounded me and started firing off questions. They were amazed that Morrison was so young and already a professor. But they said that wasn't the point. The real point was where I found a professor that handsome to go on a date with. They thought that with looks like his students must be blessed. One of them joked that if their college professors had looked like him, they never would have failed a class. I listened to them with a smile, but at the mention of not failing, I finally spoke up. I told them they would probably still fail because he teaches physics. That shut them up immediately. We had some smart people in the company, but this was a man who taught university-level physics. I suddenly felt a bit childish, but I couldn't stop myself from bragging. I told them my husband is probably what you would call a genius. I said he was young, but absolutely brilliant. I stood up and gave the managers a small smile. I told them not to daydream, because a husband this perfect was a once-in-a-lifetime find. With that, I turned and walked away without giving them a backward glance. Just as I left, I heard someone mutter that I was the boss, but I was so smug it made them want to punch me. I thought to myself that no boss is ever truly a good guy in their employees' eyes. I love my company, and I love this kind of work environment. We could relax when it was time to relax, and work hard when it was time to work. It was exactly the kind of environment every young person dreamed of. After leaving my office, Morrison didn't go home. He went to find Harper. He and his best friend had gone shopping for some battle armor a while back, but he hadn't had a chance to use any of it yet. He was clueless when it came to relationships and desperately needed a strategist. Harper was your classic trust fund kid whose family was loaded, so she spent her days as a minor influencer. She spent her time posting makeup tutorials and restaurant reviews on TikTok. Morrison found her having afternoon tea at her family's cafe. Harper saw him and waved, asking what she could get for her handsome friend. She asked where he was coming from. Even though Harper had known Morrison for years, she still found herself momentarily stunned by his looks. He was just that handsome. Morrison sat down across from her with a playful smile on his face. He joked about how she knew and told her he had just come from having lunch with his wife. He said he would pass on the coffee since I had just made him tea. Harper gave him a tight-lipped smile. She asked how she could possibly have known he had just come from seeing his wife. She asked if he was just there to rub it in. She looked at the pure, unadulterated joy on Morrison's face and just didn't get it. She wondered how I had managed to be married to this beautiful, sweet man for 2 years and not made a move. She decided she would have to find time to ask Julian if I was all talk and no action. Harper looked at Morrison with a serious expression on her face. She asked if he was really telling her that they had been married for 2 years and were still in this chaste, hands-off relationship. She pointed out that they hadn't even held hands. She suggested that they should just sleep together and figure the rest out later. The suggestion even had Morrison seriously considering the idea. He thought to himself that honestly, a part of him thought so too. But he told himself, I must have my reasons for acting this way. He believed I was trying to respect him and our relationship. He thought about how good I was to him. Harper slammed her hand on the table and told him this wasn't about respect. She reminded him that he had the looks, the body, and the brains. She said he was a complete idiot when it came to me. She asked what kind of woman has a perfect husband like him and insists on a pure relationship. Harper felt like she was losing her mind over the situation. She thought that if Morrison were her husband, she would have him locked away for daily fun and games. Finally, Morrison couldn't take it anymore and earnestly told her that his wife was not incapable. He asked her to please stop saying that. This wasn't the first time Harper had said it. Morrison knew it was just her way of talking, but it still bothered him. Harper apologized for her big mouth and said she didn't really mean it. She held her phone up to Morrison's face and told him she wanted to show him something. She said that for adults, a chaste romance is fine, but she thought we were better suited to the sleep together first, ask questions later approach. Morrison asked her if that was really right, feeling a little flustered by the idea. Morrison had a feeling Harper wasn't the most reliable source of advice. But the sleep together first idea was something he secretly agreed with. He was just too much of a coward to actually act on it. He handed the phone back to Harper, a suspicious blush appearing on his cheeks. He told her he felt like he needed a proper reason and couldn't use that approach yet. Harper sighed at her friend's blushing face. She suggested he should just have a few drinks, pretend he's drunk, and sneak into my room. She said the problem would be solved. I was completely oblivious to their conversation. I ended up working late and couldn't make it home for dinner. so I just had takeout at the office with my team. By the time I was done, it was after 8. On a normal night, I would have stayed to clear out some of the less urgent paperwork on my desk. But today, the image of Morrison arriving with that lunch container kept popping into my head. In the end, I decided to call a night. I realized that if we were going to make this work, we had to make time for each other. After leaving the office, I hesitated for a second before calling Morrison. He answered quickly, and I could tell from the cheerful lilt in his voice that he was happy. I didn't even realize it at first, but there was a smile in my own voice too. I asked him if he wanted to get a late-night snack since I was heading home now. There was a pause on his end before he answered cautiously. He said he wasn't very hungry right now and that it was still early. He wondered to himself if saying no meant he wouldn't get a chance to have a late-night snack with me tonight. I was taken aback for a second. I told him of course not, and that if he thought it was too early, we could go out later. I said I would head home now. He said okay, his voice sounding bright, and told me he would wait for me at home. His voice was so light and happy that it was infectious. After hanging up, I caught my own goofy grin in a rearview mirror and clicked my tongue. I was done for hook, line, and sinker once again. I told myself to look at how I was acting like I'd never been flirted with before. I guess even this tentative getting-to-know-you phase was enjoyable with a man I was so drawn to. It was just a shame that we had wasted 2 years, but it wasn't too late. When I got home and opened the door, the figure on the sofa shot up and greeted me with a sweet smile. He said I was back. I took in what he was wearing and froze for a second. Usually, when we were home, we kept to our separate rooms or studies. Even when we ran into each other in the house, he was always impeccably dressed. But now, perhaps because of the summer heat, he was wearing a simple white tank top and black shorts. Just then, Morrison trotted over to me, his eyes sparkling as he looked up at me. He told me it was still early and asked if I wanted to shower first. He naturally reached out and took the blazer from my hand. The dark fabric tangled around his elegant fingers, a sight that felt surprisingly suggestive to me. I took a sharp inward breath. I wondered if maybe I'd been working too hard lately, because why else would my heart suddenly be racing like this? Before I could even process it, I heard a delicate whisper in his head. He was wondering if I would like this simple guy next door look. Hearing his thoughts and seeing him steal a glance at me, a smile played on my lips. I reached out and gently patted his head. I asked him if the AC wasn't a little cold for that outfit. It wasn't revealing, but it seemed a little light for sitting in the air conditioning. Morrison looked as if I had actually read his mind, and he blushed. He said it was okay and that he had turned the temperature up a bit, so it wasn't that cold. He had, of course, changed into this outfit the moment he got off the phone with me. I smiled and said, all right, I would just go change then. I told him I would shower when we got back. I started up the stairs to my bedroom, but after a few steps, I turned back and told him that actually he looked good in anything. Sure enough, even from the top of the stairs, I could hear the screaming in his head, followed by a broken record repetition of how his wife had complimented him. He was as adorable as a little kid. Morrison's looks were striking, almost intimidatingly so, from his features to his physique. But his real personality was so adorable that I felt like I had truly hit the jackpot. We had both, by chance, ended up wearing black and white tops. It looked like we were wearing a couple's outfit. I raised an eyebrow at him and said it looked like we were on the same wavelength. I added that I liked his other outfit too. Morrison's lips curved into a small smile at the compliment. He said he would wear that one for me at home then, rather than for going out. He said, let's go, and came to my side as he spoke. He thought that if I liked it, he would only wear it for me. He wondered if I would like the new underwear he had bought. Hearing that, my steps faltered for a moment. I wondered if he was serious about the new underwear. Morrison quickly reached out to steady me, his body naturally pressing close to mine. He asked what was wrong, a hint of concern in his voice. My expression must have been strange to him. I shook my head and said it was nothing. I asked him what he was in the mood for, since it was pretty late. He suggested some porridge and mentioned a place that had just opened across the street. I hadn't even realized that so many new shops had opened up nearby. I rarely paid attention to my surroundings on my way home. From the way he spoke, it sounded like he was a regular at the place. I asked him if he went out for late-night snacks often. He said sometimes he did, if he got back from the lab late or got hungry while reading at night. That reminded me of when we first moved in together. He used to knock on my door and ask if I wanted a late-night snack. I was usually still working and didn't have a habit of eating late, so I always declined his offers. I realized I didn't even remember the expression on his face back then. I probably didn't even look up from my work. So after I rejected him, he must have just gone out to eat by himself. The thought made me look at him again. Looking more closely this time, his profile was clean and simple. His skin was flawless even without any products on it. The corners of his mouth were turned up in a slight smile. He was telling me about all the best places to eat in the neighborhood. Maybe because I hadn't responded, he turned to look at me, his eyes meeting my steady gaze. Morrison paused and then touched his own cheek, asking if there was something on his face. I said no and smiled, telling him that he must get told he is handsome all the time. His face went blank for a second, and then I got to watch in real time as a blush spread from his neck all the way to the tips of his ears. In a matter of seconds, his entire face was bright red and his eyes started to dart around. He asked if that was so, but I could see that even as he said it, he couldn't suppress a smile. His mind was a complete jumble of thoughts. Whenever he made eye contact with me, it was like he lost control of his thoughts, and especially his mouth. Right now, for instance, he was fighting the urge to blurt out a question about holding hands since he was so handsome. His voice trailed off into a mumble, and he lowered his head. I found it amusing, but I reached out, took his hand, and held it in mine. I admitted that I didn't have a lot of experience with this, especially the relationship part. I told him I was worried about moving too fast and making him uncomfortable. I told him that if he wanted something, he could just tell me. I reminded him that we agreed to try and make this work. He just mumbled an okay, and I got the feeling he hadn't heard a single word I said. But the hand I was holding wasn't still, it shifted within my palm. I wasn't sure what he was doing, but I relaxed my grip to let him move. I felt his soft fingers move slowly, weaving through mine until our hands were firmly clasped together. He gave our joined hands a happy little swing and then tilted his head to look at me. The blush on his cheeks refused to fade. I looked at him and couldn't help but smile back. We had just walked into the porridge shop and sat down when he announced that since I said he could say whatever he wanted, he was going to say it. I nodded, completely unprepared, and told him to go ahead because I was listening. He took a deep breath, looked me straight in the eye, and declared that our parents wanted us to give them a grandchild soon. I stared at him dumbfounded. I had told him to be direct, but I didn't mean that direct. His opening line was actually about us having a baby. I felt a little helpless, but I wasn't repulsed by the idea at all. It even made me think that maybe I shouldn't be approaching our relationship with the same logic I use for business deals. Compared to his honesty, I felt like I wasn't being open enough with him. Morrison looked at me, a little taken aback, and asked if that was too direct. He apologized, but said there was really no need to beat around the bush. He asked if I had forgotten we were having dinner at our parents' house tomorrow. We had been married for 2 years, and even though our relationship was strained, we still had dinner with our parents once a month. I told him I remembered and that I would come pick him up tomorrow. I asked if he had class in the afternoon. His voice was filled with surprise, which he quickly tried to hide from me. He asked if I actually remembered his class schedule and said he would be waiting for me at home tomorrow afternoon then. But he warned me that his parents would probably bring up the baby thing tomorrow. In his head, he was ecstatic that I remembered his class schedule, thinking it meant I cared about him. He concluded that if I cared about him, it meant I had him in my heart. He thought that if I had him in my heart, it meant I liked him. He told himself he had warned me about his parents pushing for a baby and felt it was his fault for not being able to give them what they wanted. He thought about how he used to use the excuse of being too busy, but he had used it so many times he didn't think they would buy it this time. He was so stressed. It turned out my parents had been pushing for a baby for a long time. I had never heard a single word about it. That could only mean one thing. Morrison had been shielding me from their pressure this whole time. Just then, the porridge arrived, steaming hot in its clay pot. Looking at his simple, pale face through the rising steam, I thought about how this seemingly naive guy was also surprisingly resilient. He had been secretly loving me, pretending to be someone he thought I would like day after day, and shielding me from my family's pressure. There were probably a lot of other things he had done for me after we got married that I didn't even know about. I told him that from now on, if my parents brought up the baby thing, he should just tell them to talk to me. Or he could just tell them that I was the one who wasn't ready. He said it was really okay. He said his parents weren't unreasonable and just thought about how we had been married for 2 years. That was what he said out loud, but the scheming look in his eyes was impossible to miss. He thought that if they didn't bring up the baby, he wouldn't have a way to get into my bed. He believed this was the only reasonable excuse he could come up with after thinking about it for ages. He thought he didn't really care about having a baby and just wanted to be close to me. Now it was my turn to pause. The guilt and gloom I had been feeling moments ago suddenly lifted. I looked up at Morrison, who was staring at me with an expression of pure, undisguised adoration. He probably hadn't expected me to look up so suddenly. He froze for a second, then blushed and quickly looked away. I asked him about living alone while studying abroad and if he valued his personal space. He said it was fine and that he was still young then, so his mom lived with him for a while. It was only after he got older and more used to living abroad that he got his own place. He wondered what I meant by asking him that and told himself he was probably overthinking it. He thought that he did value his personal space but was too scared to say it. But he imagined that if he said that, there might be a small chance I would invite him to move into my room. He told himself it was dark out and a guy could dream. He thought about how I was being so gentle tonight and how it was making him feel bold. I had to fight back another laugh because the tone of his thoughts was just too amusing. I wondered how a distinguished professor could have such a one-track mind. I asked him if he wanted to move in with me. I told him to stop fantasizing because I was actually inviting him. At that, his previously active inner monologue came to a dead stop. His already large eyes went even wider as he stared at me, looking completely stunned. I quickly added that it was just a suggestion, and if he didn't want to, that was fine. I pointed out that we are married, and he seemed pretty eager to get into my room anyway. Before I could even finish, Morrison blurted out that he would move. He immediately clapped a hand over his mouth in embarrassment and stammered out an explanation. He said it was just because we had been married for 2 years, and if we were going to make this work, living together seemed reasonable. He glanced up at me, and when he met my smiling eyes, he quickly looked down again in embarrassment. I loved watching his little movements. He reminded me of a kitten I once had that was cautiously testing its boundaries. The excited screaming in his head was getting a little overwhelming, so I quickly spoke up. I told him that was good and not to worry, because I wouldn't do anything until our relationship reached that point. His mental screaming stopped dead. He wondered what I meant by that, and why I wouldn't do anything to him. He questioned if he wasn't handsome or sexy enough for me. He thought to himself that he wasn't afraid of what I would do to him, but rather that I would do nothing at all. He decided it was fine, and he would move in first and figure something out later. I pushed the side dishes toward him, trying to distract myself before I heard any more of his wild thoughts. I told him he should eat before it got cold and the seafood porridge got fishy. I said we could deal with moving his things after we got back from my parents' house tomorrow. He thought about how he could go back and pack right now and move in tonight. While he was screaming that internally, on the outside, Morrison just gave a prim nod. He said that was fine and whatever I thought was best since his schedule was flexible. I couldn't suppress the smile on my face because my husband was so much fun. It made me want to tease him just to see his adorable reactions. After we finished our porridge, we took a slow walk home together. It wasn't too late yet, and there was still traffic on streets. I discovered that I didn't even need to hear his thoughts for us to have a natural, happy conversation. Once we were back home, we went upstairs one after the other. As we stood at our separate doorways, Morrison said good night to me, but his mind was still churning, wondering if I was really not going to ask him to move in tonight. He thought about how he didn't have much stuff and I could just carry him in. This time, I didn't indulge his inner wishes. I realized I needed some time to get used to the idea of having a roommate in my bed. I looked at my navy blue sheets, and an image of Morrison lying there suddenly flashed through my mind. I shook my head, pushing away those less than wholesome thoughts. The next day was hectic, but I still managed to leave the office on time. The moment I stepped out of my office, Julian intercepted me with a sly grin on his face. In his hands were a gift bag he had already purchased and a huge bouquet of flowers. He asked if I was heading to my parents' house for dinner. He said he already picked up the gift and that the flowers were his idea. He mentioned that he didn't think I had ever given flowers to Morrison, or at least I had never asked him to order any. He glanced at me cautiously and started to say he could take them back, but before he could finish, I took the flowers and the gift from him. I told him he likes tulips and ordered a bouquet of those for tomorrow. I walked away, trying my best to look composed. Behind me, Julian let out a happy shout of agreement, followed by a chorus of knowing chuckles from my other employees. Morrison was already dressed and waiting when I arrived home. When I handed him the roses, he immediately assumed they were for my mother. I told him I knew he liked tulips, but they didn't have any. I said these roses were for him and promised to get him tulips next time. The man holding the bouquet looked up at me, his eyes filled with pure, unhidden joy. He thought to himself that I had given him flowers for the first time. He decided he had to preserve them and planned to take them to the lab later to make them into preserved flowers. I smiled, a pang of guilt hitting me as I saw how surprised he was. I told him that if he liked them, I would send him flowers every day. He thought that would be too wasteful, but wondered if I could send them once a week. He believed that getting flowers from me would make him happy for a whole week. He thought it might even make him happy for longer than that. He wasn't being coy at all and looked at me with such hopeful eyes as he made the request. His sudden directness caught me completely off guard. His smile struck me right in the chest, sending my heart into a frantic rhythm. I promised that next time I would pick them out myself. He thought that would be amazing and that he would be happy for a long, long time. He buried his face in the fiery red roses. My heart was pounding, just like it did the very first time I saw him all those years ago. I was starting to understand what he meant about falling in love with the same person over and over again. It felt completely real. I looked at Morrison's face, which was even more delicate than the flowers, and touched the bridge of my nose with a smile. I asked him if the happy Professor Sterling was ready to go home with me now. Morrison felt like he was a complete lost cause in love. Plenty of people called him Professor Sterling, but when it came from my lips, it sounded intimate, almost like a caress. It transformed a simple title into something truly special. He hugged the flowers tighter, murmured in agreement, and with a blush on his cheeks, set the bouquet on the table. He gently stroked a petal, his eyes crinkling with a smile. He thought they were such beautiful flowers and that I was such a gentle wife. He noted to himself that this was the 999th time Morrison Sterling had fallen in love with me. He hoped his dream would come true soon. After the 998th time, this was the most earnest thought I had ever heard from him. Usually, his mind was a lively, chaotic jumble of disconnected ideas. But whenever he counted the times he had fallen for me, his thoughts became reverent and sincere. The drive to my parents' house wasn't long, taking only about 10 minutes. When we arrived, my mom immediately pulled Morrison aside for a private chat. I was dispatched to the kitchen to help my dad with dinner. My dad asked the usual questions about work and life, then suddenly changed his tone to ask how things were between Morrison and me. I told him they were fine and asked why. My dad's brow furrowed slightly as he asked if I was wearing the jade pendant he had given me. His question felt odd, and the subject change was way too abrupt. I pulled the jade pendant out from under my shirt and confirmed that I was wearing it. I mentioned that I only take it off to sleep and shower. I couldn't help but sigh and remind him he was a professor, asking since when he had become so superstitious. Seeing that I was wearing it, his expression relaxed a bit. He just grunted and told me to just keep wearing it because it was good for Morrison and me. He paused and asked if I had noticed anything different since I started wearing it. I wondered what could possibly be different about a simple pendant. I wondered if it was radioactive. I was about to dismiss the idea, but then I remembered that the mind reading had started not long after he gave it to me. I wondered if it could actually be some kind of magic. I decided to play along, lowering my voice conspiratorially to tell him that lately I had been feeling a little off, as if I kept hearing voices. I watched his face carefully as I spoke, but he was already heating a pan on the stove. His expression was unreadable as he just pointed for me to bring him the meat. He told me I should just get some rest and maybe see a doctor. His casual dismissal of my comment made me frown. I thought that maybe I was just overthinking it. I wondered if it really had nothing to do with my dad, but I just couldn't tell for sure. The atmosphere at dinner was great until my mom asked directly when Morrison and I were planning on having a baby, since I wasn't getting any younger. She mentioned that my sister and her husband barely see each other, so she doesn't push them. But since Morrison and I live together, she asked if we were deliberately avoiding it. Morrison quickly jumped in and told them it wasn't my fault and that he had been the one who was too busy. My mom told him not to cover for me, saying she could easily look up his teaching schedule if she wanted to. She turned her gaze to me, probably thinking it would be rude to ask about my personal performance. But with the way young people live these days, staying up all night, it was a valid concern for her. She paused and said she had booked a full physical for both of us and told us to go when we had time. I protested, saying I was just busy before. She asked about now, since that was the past. My mother might be getting older, but her mind was as sharp as ever. Morrison thought about what about now and if I wanted to make a baby. He told himself he was ready to cooperate whenever I was. I shot Morrison a knowing look, and he was staring back at me with a perfectly innocent expression, looking pure and pristine. I told him I wasn't busy anymore, but asked them not to rush us, saying that all the pressure wasn't helping the situation. Morrison wondered what I meant by that, and if I really wanted to. He thought to himself that he was ready for me. He decided he was going to go home tonight and break out the stuff Harper had given him. He was excited for cuddle time. I quickly put a piece of meat on both his plate and my mom's and told everyone to let's eat. My parents exchanged a look. They could clearly sense that the atmosphere between us was different this time. In the end, they dropped the subject. On the drive home, I kept waiting for him to bring up the massage again, but he never did. He didn't even mention it in his head. So when we got home, I made a point of stretching dramatically and rubbing my own shoulder. I thought that was a clear enough hint for him. Sure enough, Morrison noticed. He watched me, hesitating for a moment before finally speaking up. He said he had learned some massage techniques from the other professors at work and asked if I wanted him to try. He added that he wasn't licensed but was amazing at it. He was mentally begging me to let him try and said he would be so sad if I didn't. He thought that if I cooked and he massaged, he would be the perfect, considerate husband. He wanted a chance to show me what he could do. Listening to his internal pleading, I smiled and told him I was in his hands. My words made his eyes go wide with surprise. He thought about how I called him Morrison and how different it sounded when I said it. He felt like his whole body was turning to jelly. I watched his face turn a deeper and deeper red as his thoughts grew wilder by the second. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore and stammered that he would come find me in a bit. With that, he practically fled the room. Watching him stumble awkwardly up the stairs, I felt a pang of regret. He was so shy, and I wondered if the massage was off now. I told myself I shouldn't have teased him. But an hour later, a soft knock came at my door. The man standing there was wearing a white silk robe. His long, slender legs immediately caught my eye. His pale skin was flushed a delicate pink, and his almond eyes, which could be so seductive, now held a look of pure, wide-eyed innocence. He softly said my name and told me he was there to give me that massage. I turned at the sound of his voice, and for a moment, I completely forgot to breathe. He was wearing a white silk robe I had never seen before, with the hemline barely grazing his thighs. His long, straight legs seemed to glow in the soft lamplight. Fresh from the shower, his skin had a tempting pinkish glow. Those almond eyes, usually so cool and composed, were now shimmering with nervousness as he looked at me with an innocent gaze. My Adam's apple bobbed as I swallowed hard. I forced my gaze away from him and tried to sound as casual as possible. I reminded him he said he'd learned a few things and told him to just try not to burn himself this time. He thought about how hot I looked just out of the shower, with my hair still dripping and my collarbones looking sexy. He told himself to get a grip. He told himself he was there to conquer me, not the other way around. He focused on the massage, telling himself he was a professional. Listening to his internal pep talk, I couldn't hide my smile any longer. I patted the space on the bed next to me and invited Professor Sterling over to see what he had. He shuffled to the edge of the bed and knelt beside me. His fingertips were cool as they rested on my shoulders. His movements were a little hesitant, but the pressure was perfect. I closed my eyes, feeling his soft fingers work at the knots in my muscles. I could smell our shared body wash on his skin, mixed with his own unique, faint fruity scent. He thought about how broad my shoulders were and how firm my muscles felt. He wondered if this was what security felt like. He giggled to himself about feeling them a little longer and wondered if I liked what he was doing. He questioned if he should press harder and wondered why I wasn't saying anything. He worried if it wasn't comfortable and feared he might break me. I told him it was perfect, sensing his anxiety, and said he was a natural. At the praise, the frantic thoughts in his head exploded into a fireworks display of joy. He was ecstatic that I had praised him. His hands moved with renewed focus. The room was quiet, filled only with the sound of his soft breathing and the rustle of fabric. It was a peaceful, tender moment, the likes of which I hadn't experienced in our entire 2 years of marriage. I suddenly called his name, opening my eyes and catching his hand as it moved across my shoulder. I told him we should stop sleeping in separate rooms and invited him to move in with me. His body went rigid, and the fireworks in his mind instantly went nuclear with excitement. He questioned if I was really asking him to move in. He wondered if I was serious, and if I meant what he thought I meant. He thought about how this was all happening so fast, and wondered what he should say. He told himself he had to be cool about it. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his expression neutral, and whispered an agreement in a voice that was barely audible. The next day, Morrison's move was shockingly fast. It was less of a move and more of a personal relocation directly into my room. Our life entered a new, sweet chapter that felt like a dream. My mind-reading ability became the ultimate cheat code for our relationship. I knew what he wanted to eat, where he wanted to go, and even when he just needed a hug, all before he even had to ask me. Slowly, he dropped his guard, revealing his true, affectionate self to me. But the peace between us didn't last forever. My company's flagship original graphic novel, a project we had invested heavily in, was suddenly preempted. A rival company released a story with an almost identical concept and plot just before our scheduled launch. My company was immediately embroiled in a plagiarism scandal. Our stock plummeted, and we faced an unprecedented crisis. To make matters worse, an anonymous email was sent to all of my senior staff. It contained proof that Morrison had accessed our company's internal network and downloaded core files. It alleged he had stolen trade secrets to give a rival research project at his university in Edge. The atmosphere in the conference room was absolutely glacial. All eyes were on me, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and pity. I just sat there quietly, looking at Morrison beside me, his face completely ashen. His lips were pressed into a thin line, but I could hear the desperate, broken cries in his mind. He was swearing to himself that he didn't do it. He was mentally begging me to believe him and saying that someone was framing him. He wondered why I was looking at him like that, and if I didn't believe him either. In that instant, my heart felt like it was being stabbed with needles. But I knew this wasn't the time for sentiment. Whoever had targeted my husband had clearly come prepared. I knew that if I showed my trust in him too easily, the real culprit would only dig in deeper. I took a deep breath and, in a voice colder than I had ever used with him, told Morrison that until this was investigated, he was suspended from all company-related duties. I told him to go home and wait for my call. He snapped his head up to look at me, his beautiful eyes wide with shock and disbelief. That shock slowly faded into a dead, empty gray expression. He said nothing. He just stood up and walked out of the conference room. After he left, I immediately had Julian start digging into the rival company, especially anyone who had been in recent contact with them. At the same time, I called Harper and asked her to go stay with Morrison and to help me find out what she could about Victoria Harrington. My gut told me she was involved. Sure enough, that night, as I deliberately kept my distance from Morrison at home, I overheard Victoria's triumphant thoughts. She thought everything was going according to plan. For the next few days, I gave Morrison the cold shoulder. The atmosphere in our house was frigid. I listened to the entire progression of his thoughts, from hurt and confusion to utter despair. Every moment was like a knife twisting in my own heart. I knew it was cruel, but it was the only way to make our enemy let their guard down. Finally, on a rainy night, he broke. He didn't cry or scream. He just silently packed a bag, got in his car, and drove away. I tracked his car's GPS and saw he had gone to the old neighborhood where we first met. I followed him immediately. Rain slicked the old alleyways. He was standing under an umbrella, perfectly still, at the entrance to the alley that had changed both our lives. Through the wind and rain, I heard his broken thoughts. He remembered that this was the place and pictured me wearing my high school uniform, backlit by the sun. He thought about how I looked like a hero when I said I thought I'd found a lost kid. He thought about how he had loved Sarah Miller for so many years. He wondered why, in the end, I couldn't give him even a little bit of trust. He questioned if he was wrong to pretend to be the person he thought I wanted. He thought about how I was his first love and that from the very beginning it was always me. As I heard this, the memories of that lost kid came flooding back to me. I remembered the ninth grade boy, so small for his age because he had skipped grades, cornered by a few bullies. I remembered him staring them down with wide, defiant eyes and refusing to cry. It was him. I couldn't hold back any longer. I strode forward and pulled him into a tight embrace from behind. He trembled violently in my arms, his umbrella clattering to the wet pavement. I told him I was sorry, whispering it hoarsely in his ear. I said I was so sorry, Morrison, and that it wasn't that I didn't believe him, I was just putting on a show for the real enemy. I told him I believed him from the very beginning and that I had only ever believed him. I laid out my entire plan for him right there. And I told him that I finally remembered. I remembered him, the cute, stubborn lost kid I had found all those years ago. In my arms, his silent sobs turned into a torrent of tears as he finally let out all his pain and fear. With Harper and Julian's help, we quickly gathered all the evidence of Victoria's and the rival company's malicious setup. At their press conference, just as they were triumphantly announcing their original new work, I walked in with my lawyer and the police. The big screen behind them switched from their promotional video to a recording of Victoria conspiring with her accomplices, along with irrefutable proof that they had fabricated evidence and hacked our company's servers. Victoria's face went pale when faced with the evidence, and she was arrested on the spot. The crisis was averted. My company was not only exonerated, but in a twist of fate, we gained massive public sympathy and attention. After weathering the storm together, my relationship with Morrison became unbreakable. Afterwards, I asked my father about the jade pendant. He was silent for a long time before he told me that the jade pendant was the Sterling family's ancestral unity jade. He explained that the pendant was intended to help us see through deception and overcome that difficult trial. My father told me that now that the two of us were truly connected, its power should be fading, and it turned out he was exactly right. Following that day, I began to hear Morrison's thoughts less and less frequently. The voice in my head grew fainter with each passing day until eventually my world fell completely silent. I didn't feel any sense of loss when the silence finally arrived, and instead, I felt a profound sense of peace. I realized that I no longer needed that secret cheat code because I had finally learned how to understand him on my own. I had finally learned how to love and how to trust using my own heart. Julian and Harper also managed to reconnect during our joint operation, resolving their old issues and getting back together in a very public way. A year later, we found ourselves together in the delivery room. Morrison was completely drenched in sweat, and his grip on my hand was so incredibly tight that his nails were digging into my skin. He was in far too much pain to speak, and his face was a mask of tears and absolute effort. Seeing him in so much pain was truly agonizing for me. All I could do was kiss his forehead again and again while whispering words of encouragement into his ear. Just then, in the quiet of my own mind, a faint but crystal clear, tearful voice cried out. He was mentally screaming for the baby to get out of there, threatening to scratch his husband's handsome face off if it didn't happen right now. He was mentally questioning why I had put him through this and swearing he was never doing it again, though he added that if I kissed him, he might consider just one more. I froze for a heartbeat before leaning down and pressing a deep kiss to his sweat-dampened lips. In a voice that only he could hear, I whispered that I heard him and promised that we were done after this one. Morrison's eyes flew open instantly, and his face became a picture of pure shock. A second later, A loud and clear cry filled the entire room as our child was finally born. Amid the beautiful sound of our baby's cries, he looked up at me and gave me a weak but incredibly happy smile. His almond eyes were once again shining with a galaxy of brilliant stars. Trust isn't some superpower that eventually fades away. It is a choice you keep making every single day until the quiet between you finally feels like home.